All right. Hi, everyone. Can you all see and hear me without any problems?
I have a calendar I pulled online that literally just gives me the weather today.
I hope so. Oh, there someone said yes. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So, it is a bit windy today. So if you hear any gusts of wind, apologies. Hopefully it won't affect the audio in any way. So what we're doing today is beginning the chapter on new directions. That's new directions in epistemology, to be specific. So we're going to do a couple of things this week. We're going to look firstly at the notion of naturalized epistemology, which is basically the idea, due ultimately to Quine, that epistemology ought to be part of the natural sciences. Can we make sure the microphones are muted, please?
Hydrothermal material not be
Yeah, we finally arrived. Well, this is a photo of actually, this is Rodin's sculpture, The Thinker. And at one point in the chapter, Crumley actually mentions this. Traditional epistemology is this sort of armchair epistemology. It's done, purely contemplatively. There's no lab, right? So if you're like Descartes or Hume, you're doing it from the armchair. You're sitting and thinking like this, a bit like Rodin's The Thinker, right? Um, this tradition goes back quite a ways, as I indicate in the slides. I mean, somewhat Aristotle, but mainly Plato, right? Plato, being the sort of original rationalist, thinks that um, the use of reason alone is enough for us to come to know things, including when we're doing epistemology. Even if you're not a rationalist, like David Hume, say you're an empiricist. Um, you still probably think of epistemology as something that is prior to the sciences. So it's not something you do in a laboratory. It's something you do by thinking about it, by exercising reason. But in the 20th century, thanks to Quine, this other way of understanding epistemology emerged, and that is as a part of the natural sciences. So the natural sciences are the sciences we use to study the natural world, right? So physics, chemistry, biology, those kinds of things. Epistemology is part of that, says Quine. Um, One of the things that we'll look at next time is this idea that epistemology was done kind of by and for men, right? That's what feminist epistemology is a response to. And if you look through the history of philosophy, um, it looks like the feminist philosophers are right. Um, women were excluded from doing philosophy in most times and places. Not everywhere. There are exceptions, but generally speaking, most epistemology was done by men, and it was done in a sense for men. And these men also had, as we'll see on Thursday, these sort of gendered ideas about reason, rationality. Feminist philosophy tries to address these concerns. So we'll look at that on Thursday. Today, we're going to be looking at the natural epistemology stuff. And this comes from a paper by Quine called Epistemology Naturalized, which he published in 1969. And here again, he argues that epistemology should be viewed as part of the natural sciences rather than prior to the sciences. So, one of the things Quine does in this paper is argue that the actual aim of epistemology is discovering the causal link between evidence and theory, not really the justification link between belief and evidence. So, we've spent a lot of time talking about justification, especially post Gettier, right? What does it mean to be, if knowledge is a justified true belief, then what does justification mean? Gettier cases show us that um, we can have justified true beliefs where the justification isn't linked, doesn't provide the link between the evidence and the belief that we want it to. We're sort of lucky. So what does justification really amount to? Quine says, well, don't worry about it. We're doing what a scientist does, and that is trying to uncover the causal link between the evidence we have and the theories we have. Theories here you can read as beliefs. So, in order to sort of get a sense of the sort of thing that uh, Quine is arguing against, let's review some tenets of traditional epistemology. We could call traditional epistemology or think of traditional epistemology as Cartesian epistemology. Um, uh, eh, what I mean by that, and what I think Crumley means by that, is not that it's all due to Descartes, but it occurs in that sort of traditionalist or foundationalist tradition of Descartes. And the two particular tenets that Quine is concerned with are epistemology's commitment to foundationalism. Remember, Quine is not a foundationalist. Quine is a coherentist. So we've already kind of seen how he counters foundationalism. He also questions this commitment to a priori reasoning. And I think that's quite evident. Like if he's arguing that epistemology is ought to be naturalized, if it's part of the sciences and not prior to the sciences, that sounds pretty empirical, right? Um, Pretty a posteriori. If what we're trying to do is discover a causal link, and not sort of articulate, a justification link between evidence and belief, what we're doing is pretty empirical. And remember further from last week, right? Foundationalism says that we have basic beliefs that are kind of epistemically independent. They're justified, but they're not justified by other beliefs. These could be perceptual beliefs, they could be a priori beliefs, introspective beliefs, etc. But whatever they are, if you're a foundationalist, you think that these are infallible, right? And this is another thing that, thanks to Descartes, right? Descartes um, tried to discover one infallible belief upon which he could build up the rest of his beliefs, and that was the cogito, right? So once we have a basic belief or a set of basic beliefs, we can kind of trace the justification of our non-basic beliefs back to the basic ones. Um, so that's the foundationalist stuff. What do we mean when we say that um, epistemology is an a priori sort of endeavor? Well, we discover the conditions of justification by reasoning about them a priori. We just think about them. We don't need to go out and do an experiment. We can say, think about it. If you really think you know something, that must be because you have a belief that's true and well justified. Or even if we want to, go back to Gettier and bring up the sort of counter examples that he talks about, the Gettier cases. Those are um, imagined scenarios where we have justified true beliefs that a lot of us would be hesitant to call knowledge. Just by thinking about these things, we can come to know them, right? Now, traditional epistemology does not say that we can't come to knowledge using a posteriori reasoning, right? Everybody agrees we can come to certain knowledge in an a priori sort of way and certain other knowledge in an a posteriori way. But the conditions for knowing, those are our justification conditions, are known a priori, independently of sense experience. And this commitment actually leads to some interesting additional features of traditional epistemology. As I've already mentioned, epistemology on the traditional view is understood to be distinct from the sciences. So it's something, as I said before, is prior to the science. And I've kind of gestured at this throughout our lectures so far. Um, if you want to go and do science, if you want to come to know things empirically, you have to have some idea of what knowledge is and how we come to have it in the first place. That is prior to doing science, right? Even Descartes, right? Remember, if you've actually, I hope that maybe some of you have maybe gotten a little curious and gone and taken a look at the first meditation. It is, after all, available on the internet for free. So I'd encourage you all to do that. But right off the bat, and I think this bit is also quoted in Crumley, if you want to, or if Descartes wants to establish anything firm in the sciences, he has to work out what it is possible to know. So Descartes' meditations are, you know, insofar as he's doing epistemology in those meditations, and he's doing quite a lot of epistemology with his skeptical arguments, that is taking place prior to science. Descartes can go and make scientific discoveries about the natural world after he's worked out what knowledge is, what the conditions of knowledge are, etc. Well, yeah, Yusuf, like you have to know it's not just how to know things, because arguably science is a method of how do I find out new things? How do I get new knowledge? Science is one way to do that. Um, but before you do any of that, you've got to know what exactly knowledge is. Otherwise, how can you say you know anything, right? So that's the way in which, on the traditional view at least, epistemology is viewed as prior to the natural sciences. So we get these four features of traditional epistemology, right? The first feature is that knowledge has a foundational structure. So we have our basic beliefs. We have non-basic beliefs built up on top of those, and we can trace the justification of our non-basic beliefs back to our basic beliefs. The second is that we can arrive at epistemological principles using a priori reasoning, right? And again, if you feel like taking a look at the discussion in Plato's Meno, where Meno and Socrates are discussing what is really just an early version of the justified true belief account of knowledge, they kind of get there simply by thinking about it and talking about it. There is a sort of, I guess you could call it an experiment. That's the geometry exercise, but that's really more of a demonstration about the nature of knowledge of the forms, and it's designed to sort of it's supposed to, what is it supposed to do? Well, it's supposed to illustrate that knowledge of the forms is innate, which is another part of Plato's rationalism. But the bit about knowledge as justified true belief, right? If you remember the images of Daedalus, what we discussed concerning those, they were a sort of example for how you need to have your beliefs tied down, just like how we have to have these statues tied down, or they'll get up and wander away. That tie is justification. And we arrive at all of that on the traditional view using a priori reasoning. Thirdly, epistemology is distinct from the natural sciences. And finally, it's prior to the sciences. So epistemology is a different kind of thing than physics, um, psychology. I know that psychology is a social science, but because epistemology deals with knowledge and belief, as does psychology, um, you know, w by doing psychology or cognitive science, we're doing something different than what we do when we do epistemology. And of course, it's more fundamental than those things. We've got to do the epistemology first. Quine comes along and says, no, We're going to reject all of this. We natural epistemologists reject these tenets of traditional epistemology. Um, this commitment to a naturalized approach within epistemology comes from his, I guess, larger commitment to naturalism. Now, what is naturalism? It's the view that everything that exists is natural. And you might say to yourself, well, that sounds a little bit circular. What does that mean? Well, to to clarify it, what it means is that everything that exists in the world is either a natural object, a natural property, or a natural relation. Everything that exists in nature is the kind of thing that the natural sciences could study. So when we're talking about what is real, if we're naturalists, we're going to say things like, well, molecules, chemical elements, electromagnetic fields, um, trees, right? I'm just looking around at all the trees around me, which are made of chemical elements like water and carbon and so on. These are the only things that exists. There's nothing else. There's nothing supernatural or paranormal, for example. There's nothing that exists which admits of a non-natural explanation. And we can explain the natural world using science. So is everybody clear on what that means? Or better yet, if you're unclear, go ahead and hop in the chat and let us know. Okay, I guess we're clear. Yeah, sort of. It's just that whatever exists is natural. Um, so whatever phenomena we discover out there in the universe, they will necessarily be explicable by laws of nature, for example, right? Now, that doesn't mean to say that we're always going to know what those laws are. We might discover new ones, right? So some phenomenon could remain unexplained until we figure it out. But when we ultimately do figure out what's going on, it's a natural explanation for a natural phenomenon. Does it have to be explained? Well, there are plenty of unexplained things in the universe. Um, yes, that's right, Pernille. Um, what naturalism says is that if there is an explanation, it's going to be a natural explanation. Like, like what are some interesting, unexplained natural phenomena? Just for example. Well, sure, the universe. Yeah, like relativity versus string theory, right? Actually, I don't think it's quite right to characterize it quite like that. Um, what we're trying to do in physics, I mean, not like we, not me, I'm not a physicist, but what physicists are trying to do is reconcile um, relativity with quantum physics. But I mean a phenomenon. Magic is not a natural phenomenon. Yeah, it's good that you're thinking, yeah, dark energy. Okay, dark energy. Yeah, that's a good one. Dark energy and dark matter, right? The things are moving around out there in space, um, in a different way than we would expect if only gravitational forces were at play. So we posit things like dark matter and dark energy, which, if they exist, we would one day actually be able to discover. Right now, they're more theoretical. But the idea is that there is something in the natural world going on out there. Dreams, I'm not, yeah, like dreams, if we're going to explain dreams naturally, we would say that they are Occurrences in the human brain that happen during REM sleep, they're not messages from the gods, right? Like how we used to believe. I'm not sure what you mean by Roman concrete. I mean, the interesting thing about concrete is the Romans knew that it worked, but they didn't know why it worked. Yeah. Yeah, but there would be a natural explanation. Yeah, like for why, like, okay, we can't figure it out, but there's got to be some natural explanation. It's not like the Romans were like, okay, we're going to make some concrete and we're going to get Jupiter down here to make it like really good concrete. He's going to bless it or something. Like, no, no, no. It's due to some natural feature of the materials that are being used, right? So naturalism just means everything is natural. There's nothing supernatural. There's nothing paranormal, nothing that's truly anomalous. There might be things that seem anomalous, that seem to sort of make the laws of nature look a bit iffy, but really, all of these things have a natural explanation. Now, Quine says naturalism is, quote, the recognition that it is within science itself and not in some prior philosophy that reality is to be identified and described. So traditional epistemology on Quine's view suffers this problem where it doesn't show us how to get out of the armchair or out of our own minds and into the world.
falling down, and converted to electricity, what's called magic.
It doesn't so Khalid, we don't have to know it yet. But naturalism is a sort of view that says whatever is out there waiting to be known, and there's a lot out there that's still waiting to be known, it's all got a natural explanation. We never have to appeal to anything outside of the natural world to explain it. No supernatural forces, no paranormal entities, no gods or spirits or anything like that, right? That's naturalism. And there's different flavors of naturalism. There's metaphysical naturalism, which is the stronger one that says, like, okay, only natural stuff exists. And then there's methodological naturalism, which says maybe there are non-naturalistic things, like maybe God exists or something. Um, but that's just not the kind of thing that science studies. So science, even if there is something other than the natural world, science doesn't study that. Science only studies the natural world. Yeah, naturalism it might suggest determinism to you. Yeah. I would say more so a specific sort of or really what is just kind of another word for naturalism if you think about it. Physicalism certainly implies determinism. But we'll save t that talk for our unit on free will because we'll really have a good opportunity to get into it at that point, talking about whether you know naturalism or physicalism implies determinism and whether we can be free in a deterministic universe. So Yusuf asks, so we don't have to know the natural explanation of something that exists. We just know that since it exists, then it must be natural. Yeah, kind of. Like it's like naturalism is a metaphysical position. You're saying if you're committed to naturalism, what you're essentially saying, uh, again, on the metaphysical form, you're saying, um, I think that the only kinds of things that exist are natural things, right? That's what you're saying. Methodological naturalism, again, isn't so strong. Um, if you're a methodological naturalist, really what you're saying is something like, well, the only tool that can really study the natural world are the natural sciences. There might be other things, but maybe it's like Stephen Jay Gould, how he characterized um, science and religion as these non-overlapping magisteria. Or Galileo, right? Galileo is famously thought to have said something like, "The Bible tells you how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go," right? These are two separate things. Science is for the natural world, and maybe something else, religion, magic, whatever, is for the non-natural world. Um, why can't God be considered natural? Because God is supernatural, literally. God is supernatural in the sense that God is at least the Abrahamic God is believed to be sort of over and above nature, right? Uh yeah, Sean, you've heard of that. Yeah, non-overlapping magisteria. Yeah, no, when we say supernatural, like God, if God exists, then God is supernatural because God stands above it all. God uh creates the universe. He sets the laws of nature, but he's not bound by them. So if you think of like again, and I'm sticking pretty close to the Abrahamic tradition here, but think of miracles, right? Miracles. Most philosophers reject the existence of miracles, but let's say that there was a miracle. Um, your explanation is that God did it, not that, oh, some forces of nature combined in such and such a way to allow this to happen. No, no, it was an act of God or of a messenger of God or something, right? So that's the sense in which God is supernatural, right? He's not a part of the natural world. William, go ahead.
So is naturalism basically just straight up believing in science? Like that's kind of it.
That's a big part of it. Yeah. But what you believe in is specifically that science is the tool that we use to understand the natural world. Science uncovers knowledge about the natural world, right? And again, if you're a methodological naturalist, you might say, "Oh, there might be something beyond the natural," but again, science would not be what we use to study it. All right, how are we doing for time? Pretty good. So anyway, Quine is kind of concerned with this problem. If we're doing traditional epistemology or armchair epistemology, how is it that we get outside of our own minds um, into the world, right? If we begin within our minds with, I don't know, maybe like a traditional sort of set of foundational beliefs or a priori truths, how do we draw the connection between um, that and how the world is? How do we connect our beliefs to the world? That was a problem for Quine. I'll go back a slide. Like, it's not that we can't make this connection. Quine just thinks that traditional epistemology doesn't really tell us how to make this connection, right? So, how do we make this connection between basic beliefs and a priori truths and the way the world is, like what is actually true? That's a problem. If you come at it from the other end, if we start with all our beliefs about, what actually exists out there, if we start like, I say like, oh, I believe there's a tree over here because I can see it with my senses. Well, then I'm really doing a sort of rudimentary science already, right? I'm doing something empirical. We should begin with science, is actually what Quine thinks here. Um, let's talk about epistemology in comparison with another sort of science, psychology. So we've seen how Quine is motivated by this claim right here that we can't draw these logical connections between our epistemological principles, which are conceived, of a priori, and the world. So basically, the problem is we can't identify principles that tell us what we ought to believe. Now, this is going to turn out to be the really controversial bit here, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. So, Quine says rather than trying to identify principles that tell us what we ought to believe, which we can't do because traditional epistemology doesn't tell us how to connect these foundational beliefs with what's actually going on in the world, what we should do instead is ask how we came to believe the things that we do believe. As Quine writes here, better to discover how science is in fact developed and learned than to fabricate a fictitious structure to a similar effect. But even if we were to do this, like even if we were to replace traditional epistemology with something like psychology or cognitive science, epistemology would continue in some form or another, Quine says. The consequences of what Quine is saying are as follows. If we accept that what we really ought to begin with is science and not armchair epistemology, then we've abandoned this foundationalist project of identifying basic beliefs. We also don't use a priori reasoning to tell us about the nature of knowledge. Instead, we learn about the nature of knowledge within science by doing science. We learn about the nature of knowledge empirically and not deductively or a priori. So, everybody clear so far? If you're not sure, jump in the chat.
naturalized.
Nicholas?
So is Quine saying basically that instead of asking what we should believe, we should just do cognitive psychology and understand how we come to beliefs? Is that like,
Basically. Yeah.
okay,
Yeah, basically.
cool.
Yeah. So you notice interesting, Quine says that, traditional epistemology, and this is a weird thing to claim, does not tell us what we ought to believe. And this is where Jagwon Kim comes in and says, what are you talking about? Yes, it does. And also, that's the whole point of epistemology. It's normative, not descriptive, right? Um, so yeah, that's a good question. Let's see what's happening in the chat. This part is kind of confusing. Yeah, well, bear with me. Maybe it'll become clear. We'll read this quote here, and I think this is interesting because we framed a lot of this discussion again following Crumley. Crumley starts by talking about skepticism in chapter 1. The concerns of the skeptic are really, in a sense, everybody's concerns in epistemology. And we can actually respond to the concerns of the skeptic on Quine's naturalized epistemology. Quine says in a different paper, skepticism is an offshoot of science. The basis for skepticism is the awareness of illusion, the discovery that we must not always believe our eyes. Skepticism battens on mirages, on seemingly bent sticks in water, on rainbows, after images, double images, dreams. But in what sense are these illusions? In the sense that they seem to be material objects which they are in fact not. Illusions are illusions only relative to a prior acceptance of genuine bodies with which to contrast them. Rudimentary physical science, that is, common sense about bodies, is thus needed as a springboard for skepticism. So skepticism kind of presupposes a sort of science because if we're going to if we're wondering about what might be illusory or false, we must be tacitly, we must already have accepted the notion that there is something real out there that we can know about. Right? And why does Quine do this? Well, to show that science is like a naturalized epistemology, a sort of scientific epistemology, um, is an epistemology in the sense that it can answer the skeptic's challenge. Does that make sense to all of you? Now, traditional epistemologists wouldn't buy this, right? Um, they think that maybe Quine is begging the question against the skeptic. Begging the question, what is that, by the way? We should talk about this. Most people actually use this term completely wrong, right? You might be, I see people on the news using it incorrectly all the time. You know, maybe you've got some panel of experts on the news and they're talking about something. For example, well, during the pandemic, I was keeping on top of the news, looking for new developments all the time, and you'd often have a panel of experts discussing, the various like rolling sort of lockdown measures. Oh, we're seeing more of this variant of the virus, which begs the question, will there be another period of lockdowns? Well, that doesn't actually beg the question, it raises the question. Begging the question, on the other hand, is a type of fallacy where what happens is the thing you are trying to prove, the conclusion you're trying to prove, actually features as a premise in your argument. So it's a form of circular reasoning, right? Remember, we talked about this with Hume, right? Relying on the uniformity principle. We want the uniformity principle is all about induction, and we want to justify its use. Can we do that uh, by relying on induction like it's worked in the past so we know it works? No, that would be circular. Similar thing here. Maybe Quine is begging the question against the skeptic. Quine is saying, like, well, you're presupposing that there's already this, real external world that we can know. That's what you're doing when you say, oh, what if it's all a dream? But But traditional epistemologists say, well, hang on, Quine. You're using what you're trying to prove as you're sneaking that in as a premise in your response to the skeptic. So you could be begging the question, Quine. Um, Yusuf, what do you mean we can't justify the justification? Well, I mean, what Quine is saying is like he's trying to answer the challenge of the skeptic because that is something fundamental that we need to do in epistemology. That's the whole reason why Crumley starts this book with the chapter on skepticism. And Quine says, look, my natural epistemology, which is really like a science, can do that. But he might be begging the question because he's assuming or he's saying, look, the thing I've set out to prove it is also kind of snuck in as a premise in his argument against the skeptic. You see what I mean? Nicholas.
I'm not wrapping my mind around how Quine might be begging the question in this scenario. Could you re-explain that one more time?
Yes.
Like, I understand the concept of begging the question, but I don't see how Quine's argument against the skeptic
Yeah.
could be that.
So he says skepticism is an offshoot of science. Um, when he makes that claim, he's saying, like, look, the whole basis for what you skeptics are doing, which is in inquiring whether knowledge is ever possible, and more often than not coming to the conclusion that it isn't, what you're doing is assuming the existence of an objective reality, and it's science's job to discover what that's like, um, including how we come to know about that objective reality. But a traditional epistemologist would say, well, you're begging the question against the skeptic because the skeptic is going to say, how do you know there's a real world? It could be a dream, it could be a simulation, whatever, right? Um, the skeptic is not assuming the existence of an objective reality that is knowable. Quine is saying, yes, they are. Um, but the question is, um, Sorry, I'm just getting a little bit distracted here. The question is for Quine, or rather, okay, let me start over again. The thing is for Quine is maybe I'll just start over. Quine is accusing the skeptics of maybe being a little disingenuous, I suppose. He's saying they're tacitly assuming the existence of this world that they claim to question. The skeptic responds by saying, no, we're not. And the traditional epistemologist says that Quine is begging the question because one of the things that he's setting out to prove features as a premise in his argument. Um, anyway, sorry, there's an interesting conversation taking place next to me, and I just got a little distracted. Does that answer your question? Okay. And then Jaden says, uh, too much of a non sequitur, maybe, and maybe better suited. But Dr. Redstone, do you believe that in the modern world there is a need for traditional epistemology, with science proving itself to be more? Yes, yes. Like I kind of dig what Quine is trying to do, but ultimately I do think epistemology is prior to the sciences. Um, it's just not that kind of a thing. Um, and I'll get to this in a moment. I'll explain this further in a moment. Um, but yeah, they do seem to be two different kinds of things. Maybe you could think of epistemology as somewhat scientific in the sense that it is a serious, systematic attempt at coming to know things, but it's not quite the same as natural science, right? And we need both. We need science, we need epistemology. We're living in a world where access to misinformation and disinformation has never been easier, right? Um, Epistemology and science are both really important right now. And someone had their hand up. I think it was June. Go ahead.
Um, so I just want to clarify because I was a little bit like I guess unclear. So for in the sense of like with skeptics and Quine, I believe, he's like begging the question by saying like you're like saying that the skeptics are saying something is untrue, but then constantly trying to like like they believe it's untrue, but like not like believe it's true, but they like will go about thinking it's true just to prove it untrue, and like therefore they're kind of like exercising the idea that it could be true and they have to prove it wrong.
Sort of like, because remember, to be a skeptic is to engage in skepsis, which is investigation. Particularly investigate whether any of our beliefs count as knowledge, right? And the skeptic says maybe very few of our beliefs meet the standards required to be called knowledge. Maybe none of our beliefs count as knowledge. But in investigating things the way they do, Quine says, well, if you're going to claim that your experience of the world is illusion, that presupposes that there is a non-illusory world, right?
Okay, that actually made it like that analogy made a lot of sense. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
no problem. It's like I can't like if I'm Descartes and I'm thinking in my armchair like what if this is all a dream? Um that only makes sense given there are times when I am not dreaming, when I'm awake and I'm in the real world, right? So that's what Quine is saying. Of course, the traditional epistemologists, they say, hold up, Quine, slow your roll. You're actually begging the question against the skeptic. Um, but don't worry too much about this, okay? The more we go through this, um, the clearer it will become. Okay, so let's try and get a better sort like let's try and crystallize this picture of natural epistemology, right? On natural epistemology, we abandon this idea that our theoretical beliefs are justified in connection with basic beliefs. So I might have highly theoretical beliefs about the nature of the natural world that trace their justification to a set of basic beliefs. Again, this is what Descartes was trying to do with the sciences in the early modern period, right? This is why, even though you don't learn about many of the actual discoveries that Descartes made, and he did make some, you don't really learn about this in your science courses. Maybe you learn about the Cartesian plane in math class, right? But you don't learn much. But Descartes was an actual scientist. Crumley notes in chapter one how one of the interesting things Descartes did was give us the first explanation of how rainbows work by explaining the sort of way that the light is refracted through water droplets. Um, but those sorts of beliefs are only possible because they get their justification from these basic beliefs, right? A basic belief for Descartes, like I am, I exist. Like I can't be certain of my beliefs about how rainbows work if I'm uncertain that I exist. See, um, naturalized epistemology says no, forget all that. If we want to justify some scientific or theoretical beliefs, maybe beliefs about rainbows or the nature of light, the nature of water droplets, etc., we don't actually do that by connecting it to basic beliefs about, I don't know, for example, the nature of the senses or sense experience. Instead, Quine thinks that we should use something like cognitive neuroscience or cognitive psychology, or maybe all of the cognitive sciences, to tell the story of how we go from what the senses reveal to our more sophisticated beliefs. But that's not the only difference. Remember, if this is unclear, keep in mind that Quine's whole thing is that epistemology is about discovering a causal link between evidence and belief, not a priori reasoning about what counts as knowledge. So yeah, that's great. That's a good segue into this first point. Whoops, this first point here. Natural epistemology tells a causal story, not a justification story, at least not in the traditional sense. So some empirical science or collection of empirical sciences can tell us all of the events in a causal chain that takes us from something like, the light hitting your retina to forming the belief that there's a philosophy textbook on your desk, or better yet, a coffee cup on the picnic table beside you. Light, photons shine down on us from the sun. They take about 8 minutes to get here, from the surface of the sun to the surface of the earth. And some of those photons reflect off of this, and they reach my retina, cause some photo transducers, some photoreceptors to fire, send some signals to my occipital lobe, from the occipital lobe at various stages of processing to my temporal lobe, where eventually I get this sort of conscious visual representation of the coffee cup. And I form the belief on the basis of that sensation that, there's my cup of coffee right here. I think I'll take a sip, right? Um, Natural epistemology as a sort of part of the sciences in fact, like, hey, let's just say it, like neuroscience and psychology and the other cognitive sciences would give us this step-by-step picture of this causal chain that goes from the world to sensation to perception and finally to cognition. Now, one thing to note here is that we all agree, yeah, this is scientific justification, sure. Like, am I justified in believing there's a coffee cup on the table? Well, somebody could say, like, yeah, you're scientifically justified, um, but are you epistemically justified? The traditionalists would say that this is not epistemic justification. This is something else. A second thing, and this is kind of what I gestured at earlier, traditional epistemology is normative, but natural epistemology is descriptive. What is the difference? Well, normative stuff, it has to do with norms. What are norms? Norms have to do with oughts and ought nots and should nots, shoulds and should nots. For example, ought you ought you run a red light? Think about it. How many of you drive? Yeah, standards or guidelines. So you shouldn't run red lights, right? For those of you who drive, yeah, you probably shouldn't. Maybe there are certain exceptions. Maybe you've got to get someone to the hospital and maybe there's no traffic, so you run a red light. Okay. But all things being equal, we ought not run red lights. It's against the law, which is a kind of norm. It's unsafe, and we have norms that say you ought not to do things that are unsafe, right? Yeah, like there are exceptions, but overall, the norm is don't do that, right? Um, naturalized epistemology is descriptive. So a norm is like, don't run red lights. Okay. But something descriptive would tell us like, okay, so 90% of people don't run red lights, and the 10% that do so for the following reasons. Some of them just disregard the law, others are maybe there's a medical emergency, they're trying to get to the hospital, others are emergency service vehicles, which are legally allowed to run red lights, but they have to do so under certain conditions, right? Um, so it just describes the situation. It doesn't tell us what we ought to do. Naturalized epistemology is descriptive, like the sciences, and traditional epistemology is normative. Now, a lot of people, emphasize the importance of the normative character of traditional epistemology. All of this is connected to the is-ought problem, by the way, right? Which you can read about in the work of David Hume if you want to. But we won't get too hung up on that. Instead, we're going to call this the normative descriptive distinction. And it opens the door to a criticism of natural epistemology. First, let's take another step back and think about what Quine is really claiming. Quine is claiming that the cognitive sciences are really how we ought to be doing epistemology, right? Discovering the causal link between evidence and theory. Now, take a cognitive science like cognitive psychology. Is it normative or descriptive?
Like, yeah, like I know the as I made me drive the route, and then he was like, "That was good, you passed. Let's do it again." So I did the exact same
Yeah,
thing
it's
again.
descriptive, exactly. It doesn't tell how we ought to think, it tells how we do think. Cognitive psychology reveals that we have cognitive biases, that we reason about certain problems in certain ways, etc. If you want something normative, what you're really talking is logic. Logic is the science of proper reasoning. Logic does tell you how you ought to think and how you ought not to think, if you want to come to the correct answer, right? On natural epistemology, when we lose this normative character, we lose something essentially like essential to what epistemology is. And that's Jaegwon Kim's point. Jaegwon Kim says science only paints descriptive pictures. That just paints these causal pictures of what happens in the natural world and why it happens. Um, a question like, should we count these scientific beliefs as justified, is not a question that science itself answers, right? So if you're somebody like Jaegwon Kim, a critic of natural epistemology, you think that the causal story that the sciences give us is not the story of epistemic justification. And that's a problem because traditionally the story of justification is what traditional epistemologists are interested in, not the causal link between evidence and belief. Hume, think back to Hume, who argued that causal relations are not justificatory relations. Remember when we were talking about cause and effect and the uniformity principle? We're naturally inclined to believe that effects follow causes, but we're not rationally justified in believing so. These causal connections don't give us justification. There's nothing necessary about cause and effect for Hume. It's just this constant conjunction we observe. There's nothing in these observations that justify us to believe that there's a necessary connection between cause and effect, right? Just for example. Now, goodness, I'm going to lose my voice again. I think I still have some cough drops, though. I got some cough drops somewhere. I'll be okay. Thanks again to the students who gave me all of the cough drops a couple weeks ago. Yusuf, an example of what? Can you be a little more specific? I'll try and help you out. What is it exactly that you need an example of? Oh, so what Hume is saying, like think back to chapter one, right? The uniformity principle we could characterize as like, in the past, I have observed that all A's are followed by B's. Presently, I'm observing an A. Am I justified in concluding that a B will follow? Hume would say, no, you're not, because there's no necessary connection between cause and effect, on the one hand. And on the other hand, um, if we were to use induction to justify induction, that would be circular. So an example that I think is somewhat famously associated with Hume is my belief that the sun will rise in the morning. Am I rationally entitled to that belief just because the sun has always risen in the past in the morning? Well, no, I'm not, because there's nothing necessary. It's not logically necessary that the sun will rise in the morning. Any number of things could happen. I could be transported to like above the Arctic Circle at a certain time of year, and maybe the sun won't rise in the morning because depending on the time of year, it's just nighttime for days on end, or it's daytime for days on end. Or worse, the sun could explode. And then not only will the sun not rise in the morning, but the earth will be destroyed, right? Yeah, maybe I get abducted by aliens and they take me to a planet with two suns, at such that one sun is always in the sky, regardless of the time of day, right? There's nothing necessary about the sun rising, nothing logically necessary about the sun rising, in the morning today, just because I've seen it do so in the past. And if I were to say something like, well, the sun always rises in the morning, so I know it'll rise today, well, then I'm using induction to justify induction, which is circular. And that was the entire problem with the uniformity principle. Mhm. Um, Now it's these justificatory relations, just to get back to what's on the slide. How much more do we have to go here? Uh, what characterizes epistemology for Kim are the justificatory relations, not the causal explanations. Naturalized epistemology, Kim thinks, just kind of gives up on answering how we're justified in believing what we believe. So any epistemology that isn't normative doesn't count as epistemology. You can't have your cake and eat it too. If Quine wants to say, well, epistemology should really just be science, well, then Kim's response is that okay, you can do science, but that's not epistemology because science is not normative, it's descriptive. Epistemology is normative. How could a naturalist respond? We'll take a look at that shortly. Let's see what's in the chat. Yeah, sorry. I did notice my internet connection just went a little bit wonky. There's a helicopter up there. Uh, well, for causal connections, think of my coffee cup example, right? That's the kind of thing Hume is interested in. Like light reflects off of the coffee cup. Some of that light is caused to go into my eye because of the direction that it bounces off of the coffee cup. That light causes my photoreceptors to fire, which causes signals to travel down my optic nerves to my brain, etc., etc. That's the causal story. And that's what Quine says is really what we ought to look at. Not a, I mean, the chain, yes, the chain part is right. Yeah. Uh, like it's a causal chain. A causes B, causes C, causes D, etc. Again, like the best example of causation is like the billiard balls, which is why all of those early modern philosophers use it, right? Like the cue stick strikes the cue ball, which strikes the eight ball, which rolls into the corner pocket. A causes B, causes C, causes D, right? That's the causal story. So how could we respond here? Well, unlike Kim, Quine thinks that science is normative. It's not just descriptive. The scientific method, right? Observation, hypothesis, experiment, conclusion, which is a vast oversimplification, by the way, does tell us what we ought to believe. We are justified in believing things we arrive at through the scientific method. So for Quine, no, it is normative. Don't worry about it. You know? While rationalism is a type of epistemology, rationalism just says that knowledge comes from the exercise of the intellect primarily. It's a sort of different emphasis. Does knowledge comes from the from thinking about things or from using our senses? Rationalism puts the emphasis on the former, empiricism puts the emphasis on the latter. Traditional epistemology is associated in the modern tradition with Descartes. But again, remember that even empiricists believe that we can have a priori knowledge, including a priori epistemic principles that we come up with. But it's just that an empiricist would say that we can only do that once we've used our senses to acquire the relevant concepts. So they're related, but they're not exactly the same. Does that make sense, Samir? So, um, science arrives at what it arrives at, including its own methods empirically, not being not a priori. The scientific method has been improved over time using science, right? That's how Quine responds. Like, think about it. Science, back in Aristotle's day, involved no experiments. What you would do is you would observe and think. That's it. And then, um, as we get closer to modernity, we get this idea that, well, what we're doing when we're doing science is we are observing and trying to verify. Then as we get even closer to the present, along comes Karl Popper, who says, well, actually, we're not verifying. What we're trying to do is attempt to falsify, et cetera, et cetera. So all these improvements to the scientific method and refinements when it comes to what science is and what scientists actually do were arrived at um, in an a posteriori manner, not a priori. So that's all summed up in the second point here. Another example, this is Crumley's example. Like we've learned now that when we test new drugs, we've got to use a double-blind protocol. So here, the person taking the drug doesn't know if they're getting the medicine or the placebo, but neither does the doctor running the study. Why? Well, because we learned in the past that um, that the doctor knowing might influence the outcome of the experiment. The doctor might tell the patient, you know, the doctor might unconsciously, it might be like a sensory leakage thing. The doctor might unconsciously reveal what group the participant is in, which could bias the results. So what we do now is we do a double blind where the patient doesn't know and neither does the doctor. So for Quine, science is like self-correcting. Science kind of pulls itself up by its bootstraps, as it were. It bootstraps its way into informing us of what beliefs are justified and unjustified, right? Those are the responses of Quine. There are other responses too. Some might say that the normative elements of natural epistemology, if there are normative elements, depend upon natural processes. You know, the normative elements might supervene on the natural elements, maybe. Um, so we could say that there are certain normative properties that are ultimately natural. I guess that's a way of having our cake and eating it too, right? Um, think back to, for example, Alvin Goldman and his reliabilism, where for Goldman, justification is arriving at true beliefs via reliable belief forming processes. Now, how is it that we come to know which belief forming processes are in fact reliable? Well, by doing science, right? Question in the chat. I mean, I think it's neat what he's trying to do. But I also think Kim has a really good point, right? Like Jaegwon Kim says, we can't lose the normative character of epistemology, or it's not epistemology anymore. So then I guess I'm kind of left wondering, kind of like what we're discussing here, right? Like, can we get the normative stuff by doing it this way, the way Quine wants us to do? Maybe. You know, I've taught this course. I don't know how many times I've taught this course. Like four or five times, not always using this book, but predominantly with this book. And I think I'm still somewhat unsure of where I stand here. I would say I partially agree with Quine, but I also agree with Kim. Sorry if that's not a very straightforward answer, but I hope it does answer your question, hopefully. So, right, Goldman, justification is really about arriving at beliefs via reliable belief forming processes. Science tells us which are the reliable belief forming processes, right? So, cognitive psychologists could tell us how we arrive at true beliefs by giving some kind of information processing account of human learning, by telling us about which cognitive biases we suffer from and how to look out for them, right? And this is all a posteriori, not a priori. This is different from what Quine is doing, but Goldman would say it's still natural epistemology. So just keep that in mind. Yeah. Well, and that's why I always say, like, I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm here to tell you how to think. When this course is done, some of you might be rationalists, some of you might be empiricists, some will be naturalists, some will not be. Some might be traditional epistemologists, others natural epistemologists. I don't care. Um, but if you can articulate why you believe what you believe and why you think it's true, then I've done something right. Yeah. A lot, and Jaden, you're right. I think a lot of that is also about our intuitions, right? I think we come to a class like this with different intuitions about uh like what counts as knowledge, the nature of knowledge, about whether there are things other than natural phenomena, right? We all have kind of intuitions about this, which are kind of like gut feelings that are maybe hard to articulate. And what we do here is we kind of learn the vocabulary and pick up some of the tools that we need to better articulate what we actually believe. Right. And it's possible that you might believe something here, and then you get to your fourth year of university and you study more philosophy, and then you've completely changed your mind. You might start out as a rationalist here, and then before you hit grad school, you become an empiricist. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point, Levon. If I'm saying, I hope I'm saying that right. I mean, I'll put it this way. A lot of you are going to finish this class feeling like you know less than you started with. That is the point. You actually will know more than when you started, but you will feel a lot less certain about a lot of things that you believed with certainty before. And that's that. Yeah, if you're in this class and you're paying attention, I can almost guarantee you that is how you are going to feel when we're finished. Which will kind of be a full circle moment, right? Back to academic skepticism, back to Socrates. If I'm wisest, it is only by this trifle that what I do not know, I do not think I know. Yeah. I know more about not knowing anything, basically. All right, let's just finish up here on the last slide. So there's a couple different ways Crumley lays out of how we can think about traditional epistemology and natural epistemology, how they relate to one another. And this is all drawn from the work of Richard Feldman. We can go with replacement naturalism, substantive naturalism, or cooperative naturalism. Replacement naturalism says that traditional epistemology ought to be replaced by like a science or a combination of sciences. Like, maybe we should replace traditional epistemology with cognitive psychology, or indeed with the cognitive sciences in general. And the cognitive sciences, by the way, are those are just the sciences that study the mental. So it's philosophy of mind, it's psychology, it's linguistics, it's AI. I'm probably leaving some out. We actually have the only fully integrated cognitive science program in Canada at this university. It's where I got my PhD. So, just an interesting note there on the cognitive sciences. Um, this is the position that Quine takes. We'll replace traditional epistemology with something else like cognitive psychology. So that's option one. That's replacement naturalism. Substantive naturalism says that epistemic properties are actually a part of the natural world. So being justified is traceable to natural properties or natural facts. We might say, for example, that um, epistemic properties supervene on natural properties. That would be one way to make this up, or make this up. I mean, to kind of cash this out. Goldman's reliabilism seems to be an example of substantive naturalism. So when Goldman says, what provides justification for our beliefs is those beliefs having been formed via reliable belief-forming processes, he's saying that the justification is kind of baked into that, right? And then there's cooperative naturalism, where um, we see epistemology as autonomous from the sciences. Um, so questions that concern justification are still, properly speaking, epistemological. But that's not to say that an epistemologist can't then take into account what scientists discover. That the cooperative naturalist can look at the descriptive efforts of the sciences, and that might influence the development of epistemological theories which are normative. So epistemology is still independent from, but it can cooperate with the sciences. Someone asked me early, which am I? Well, like, what do I think? I think the second two are the most appealing ones to me, either substantive or cooperative. It really depends how metaphysical we want to get. Um, but substantive, or oh, I'm losing my voice again. Yeah, substantive or cooperative are appealing to me. See if I can find another one of these cough drops. Still got the thank you to whoever that was. I didn't get your name, but I still have all the cough drops. Well, I paid it forward. I actually gave some to another student. Oh, I almost dropped my cough drop. But it's that time of year. Cold and flu season is upon us. Oh, Dervish. Thanks, Dervish. Oh, that's a good cough drop. Well, it's not getting colder, but I mean that now that everybody's back to school, once it does become colder, we all spend more time inside. Well, that's when we all get sick. I don't think this is an illness. I think this is actually from this stupid thing. Don't get addicted to nicotine, everybody. Um, so that's all for today. That's natural epistemology. If you have any additional questions, pop them in the Discord server. I didn't really have much of a chance to answer too many questions last week because I was very busy throughout the weekend, over the weekend. Um, I had a little part-time gig at the Ottawa International Animation Festival. So I haven't really had a chance to check the server, but I will get back to it tonight. So if you have any questions, feel free to hop on over to the server. On Thursday, we're going to talk about feminist epistemology, which I'd like to be very discussion-based. And it's a fun topic. It's really good. Really good topic. Um, so look at the second half of that chapter in Crumley for next time, and I'll see you all on Thursday. Oh, and my laptop didn't die. Wonderful. Well, thanks everyone. See you on Thursday.